In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sea.
This legendary poem by Samuel Coleridge describes a dream born of power and desire to create a heavenly paradise on earth. For here, Kublai Khan, the supreme Mongol warlord, built a summer dream palace at Xanadu. Kublai Khan's dream has turned to dust, lost except in myth. But his magical palace of Xanadu did exist, a noble capital founded in 1256 on the edge of the Mongolian steppe. Its echo resonates across centuries and continents. For Kublai Khan's dream marked the dawn of the age of great palaces, an age when absolute power and wealth combined to create a glittering world of imperial splendors. The inheritors of Kublai's Eastern Empire were the Ming emperors of China. They believed in a marriage between heaven and earth, and, inspired by a dream of worldly harmony, built a palace whose very buildings reflected the heavens. The Forbidden City of China. The Ming Emperor Yongle created this city of palaces in 1420, a perfect realm where the emperor lived in majestic splendor. The Forbidden City was the ultimate world within a world, a city within a city, at the heart of a great empire, but entirely divorced from those outside its symbolic walls. Only the emperor and his consort could enter this rarefied palace through the Meridian Gate, the central entrance to the Forbidden City, on an axis in perfect alignment to the imperial dragon throne. One consort who understood and mastered this secret world at its zenith was Cixi, the notorious dragon empress of the 19th century. Cixi entered the Forbidden City in 1852 as a humble concubine, but quickly rose to become one of the most powerful consorts within the palace. Her extravagance and decadence became legendary. She is still remembered today, as recalled by Professor Li Shanlin.
My grandfather worked in the Forbidden City. He was the commander-in-chief of the palace guards, so he was in charge of the security for emperor and empress. Especially their food must be away from poison. So my grandfather was watching all the palace cooks. You see, from the first emperor of the Qing dynasty to the last one, no one was ever poisoned. So my grandfather's work was very important. The palace kitchens in the Forbidden City were divided into many parts. Just for the Empress Dowager Cixi, the Dragon Lady, there were about 128 best chefs in China only serving her. And one chef only cooked one dish all his life, so he could cook it the best. In the Forbidden City, just for Empress Dowager's evening meal, about 150 different dishes were prepared, but she only ate a tiny part of it.
The secrets of imperial court cuisine have not been lost. The full glory and richness of imperial dishes are still prepared by Li Shanlin as passed down by his grandfather.
Sometimes my grandfather tested the food with a silver chopstick. If the chopstick became tarnished, the food was poisonous. If it did not turn black, it means no poison.
Cixi became the effective ruler of China through her total domination of a succession of young and inexperienced emperors. Hoping to continue her supremacy, she arranged for her grandnephew, Puyi, while still a child, to succeed to the throne. The new child emperor recorded in his diaries that he was immediately immersed into a world of elaborate ritual. He recalled seeing Cixi in procession. Even a simple walk was a matter of high ceremony.
At the head marched a eunuch whose function was like that of a car horn. He walked 30 yards in front of the others, constantly hissing "shh, shh" to shoo away people in the vicinity. He was followed by 2 of the higher eunuchs walking like crabs on both sides of the path, behind which came the main group of the procession and the Empress Dowager.
In 1908, Puyi entered the Hall of Supreme Harmony for the first time as Manchu emperor. He described the occasion in his memoirs.
It was so cold when they carried me into the hall. I could bear it no longer. My father, who was kneeling below the throne, told me not to fidget. But I struggled and cried, "I don't like it here. I want to go home."
Puyi was at the center of a world of superstition and symbolism, embodied in the belief that he alone could control seasonal time and weather. Complete harmony on Earth depended on the emperor's observance of minute ritual, as stated in an ancient record of imperial rites. When the emperors made their offerings to the gods, the winds and rains were duly regulated, and the cold and heat came each in its proper time, so that the wise ruler had only to stand with his face to the south, and order prevailed under heaven. But behind the symbolism of the Forbidden City stood naked intrigue. Here, in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the Empress Dowager Cixi spun her web of conspiracy, effectively ruling the empire from behind a silk screen. This room contained not one throne, but 2, separated by a thin yellow gauze curtain. The front throne was for the boy emperor, Puyi. The second throne, placed discreetly behind the curtain, was for the Empress Dowager, a living embodiment of the expression, the power behind the throne. Puyi recorded that Cixi reveled in her reputation for ruthlessness.
Cixi had a highly developed lust for power and was most unwilling to abandon any power that came into her hands. From her point of view, the principles of moral conduct and the ancestral code existed to suit her needs. Whether it was her own flesh and blood, her in-laws, or palace officials, the same principle applied. Those who obeyed her flourished, and those who crossed her were doomed.
But Cixi did not see her dream of total control come true. The day after Puyi's accession, the Dragon Empress, suffering from dysentery, died after feasting on a huge dish of crab apples and cream. Just 4 years later, Puyi was forced to abdicate. For the next 12 years, he was allowed to continue living in the Forbidden City, all that remained of his vast empire. As a young man, he would seek solace within the beauty of the palace garden of peaceful longevity. Here he would sit with his brother, Puji, and friends, reciting poetry that expressed his feelings of isolation.
The blossom is out on the cherry tree, with a flutter on every spray. Dost think that my thoughts go not out to thee? 'Ah, why art thou so far away?' 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 'Ah, why
Pu Yi would sip wine from porcelain cups that floated along a watercourse, built in the shape of the Chinese Ru Yi character, which means whatsoever you desire. Pu Yi would attain few of his desires. As time passed, he found himself embroiled in the turmoil of a new era.
Ah, the phoenix, ah, the phoenix. Now is virtue lying prone. 'Tis vain to fret for what is over, so plan to meet what's yet in store.
In his later years, Pu Yi served as a worker for the communist state, far removed from the life he had led within the Forbidden City, a once sacred world that had lost its spirit. This had been the harmonious center of the known universe. Here, the Chinese emperors had lived in almost total isolation for 500 years, rarely seen even by their closest officials. Enclosed by 3 sets of walls, they were entirely divorced from the lives of the mortals beyond. With Pu Yi, the imperial dream of the emperor as the creator of harmony between heaven and earth died. But the Forbidden City remains as its most beautiful expression. In 1453, the Turkish Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror captured Constantinople. From the ruins of the old Byzantine Christian city grew Istanbul, and the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmet dreamt of a Muslim empire that would span the known world from east to west and would last forever. And in Istanbul, Mehmet built the palace of Topkapi, the empire's beating heart. It was a heart with many chambers. Its sensuous outward appearance reflected an internal voluptuousness. Its inner sanctum was the harem. Built on a promontory overlooking the Bosphorus, Topkapi was the home of the Ottoman sultans and their closely guarded wives and concubines, who lived in shuttered seclusion to which no outsider was ever admitted. A palace of legendary secrecy and beauty, captured in chronicles of the time.
Never had a more delightful residence been erected by the art of man. It seems not just a palace, but a town, situated on the confluence of 2 seas.
The Ottoman Empire reached its height in the 16th century and stretched from the banks of the Nile in the south to the walls of Vienna in the north. The empire doubled in size during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, grandson of Mehmet the Conqueror. The palace of Topkapi became a glittering reflection of the power and wealth of this Turkish sultan. Topkapi was a hotbed of intrigue and contradiction, for the power of these Muslim sultans depended upon an elite regiment of Christian soldiers, the Janissaries. They were seized while still children from conquered Christian families and were brought up as a privileged military caste within the palace itself. They held the balance of power, and often their favorite prince became the next sultan. Another of the most feared men within the sultan's service was the chief executioner, who lived here in the Gate of Salutations. When not called upon to execute his duties, he also functioned as the head gardener. The chief executioner was on hand to add an element of fear to the deliberations of the Grand Vizier and the Sultan's other ministers. The council met in the second court, or Diwan, to discuss matters of state. The Sultan observed the proceedings through a gilt-arched window directly above the Grand Vizier's seat. Suleiman the Magnificent was deeply involved in the day-to-day running of the empire. Any vizier who incurred his anger would be intercepted by the chief executioner at the Gate of Salutations. The vizier's severed head would be chillingly displayed by the executioner's fountain as an eloquent warning to his successor. Poets mused on this tyrannical trail of power.
The lifeblood of the Ottoman Empire seems to ebb in ever-decreasing circles, from the provinces to the capital, from the capital to the citadel of the Topkapi Palace, and finally to the inner sanctuary of the harem itself.
When not overseeing affairs of state, Suleiman relaxed within the House of Felicity, the private residence of the Sultan, the royal relatives and servants. The Gate of Felicity marked the entrance to this inner sanctum. Those admitted did not return. The harem was a labyrinthine world of secrecy and sexuality, a whispering world containing 400 rooms linked by winding stairways, tortuous passages, sunny courtyards, and even secret rooms within rooms. Sudanese eunuchs, guardians of the Sultan's household, were on permanent patrol in this courtyard. The Kisler Aga, or chief eunuch, had enormous authority within the harem. He could arrange for a beautiful woman to be placed where she would be certain to catch the Sultan's eye. In 1531, a young Russian slave girl, Roxolana, was chosen for the harem. Helped by the Kisler Aga, Roxolana became a favorite concubine of Suleiman the Magnificent. He even made her his legal wife. After Suleiman's death, Roxolana ruled the Ottoman Empire, while her son lived out his fantasies in the company of his concubines. Roxolana created a shift of power from the Sultan to the women of the harem that lasted for the next 100 years. Though the ruling Sultan, resplendent in his robes, would sit in state in this magnificent hall, real power lay with the high-ranking women of the harem who sat on sofas under the musician's gallery, observing the proceedings through veils of the finest lace.
They entered the harem, those women of unearthly beauty, languor and grace, those rarest of human flowers. They passed within the blank and mocking wall. They flitted from room to room, and yet on earth, none of them is even a shadow now.
One Sultan, Murad III, was well aware of the intense rivalry of those around him. The walls of his salon are covered in hand-painted tiles and an elegant calligraphic frieze. But one of the most beautiful aspects of the room is a three-tiered water cascade in carved marble. Rumor records that the Sultan used this salon as his bedroom because he felt that his dreams would be sweetened by the tinkling sound of water. Much more likely, the constant sound of the cascade drowned out the conversation within the salon, preventing it being overheard by jealous eavesdroppers outside. The Sultans lived in opulent splendor. Every room within the harem was designed to appeal to the senses. The cumulative effect created a heady atmosphere to which some sultans became addicted. They were as much prisoners in their gilded jail as any of their concubines. But this atmosphere of sensuous opulence disguised one of fear and oppression. The reigning sultan was often afraid to name a successor and lived in fear for his life, for there were always those ready to plot against him. a new sultan could have all his brothers and stepbrothers put to death, leaving no other claimants to power. Alternatively, he could banish them to the infamous cage, a series of rooms where, not knowing their ultimate destiny, they might remain for the rest of their lives. Locked within this pleasure palace, the princes could only watch the sultan's favorite concubines parading on the terrace outside their windows, and dream of the day when one of them might be master of the harem and all of its pleasures. The harem may have ensured that there would always be a prince available to succeed, but eventually it seeded the end of the Ottoman dream. The harem became a garden of indulgence and lust. Too many sultans were trapped within the tangled web of Topkapi, neglecting the harsh reality of the world outside. On a spring day in March 1829, Washington Irving, the American writer and inveterate traveler, was ending a 5-day journey by mule across southern Spain, taking him through the heartland of what had once been the Muslim Empire of Europe. His destination was the old Moorish city of Granada and the great fortress which dominates it, the Alhambra. He had come in search of a dream, a long-lost palace waiting to be rediscovered. The Alhambra is one of the finest legacies of the 800-year-long civilization of the Moors. The Moors invaded Spain from the north of Africa in the 8th century. They dreamt of spreading the Islamic faith across this Christian continent. Their Arabic roots were the foundations for building the most sophisticated culture in Europe, centered on a life of refinement and romance.
Buenas tardes.
Hola.
Venga conmigo.
Once through the awesome gate of justice, Irving found himself in a dream world.
The transition was almost magical. It seemed as if we were at once transported into other times and another realm, and were treading scenes of Arabian story.
Irving was allowed by the governor of Granada to move into one of the former royal apartments, and under the moonlight he became bewitched.
I am so in love with this apartment that I can hardly force myself from it. I sit by my window until late at night, enjoying the moonlight and listening to the sound of the fountains and the singing of the nightingales.
On one occasion, he caught sight of a Spanish lady and her escort in the gardens below. Speaking softly, her whispers drifted through the night air. The scene was so memorable that Irving was later to record the words of her poetry in his diary.
The hand of love enveloped us by night in a robe of embraces, which was torn away by the hand of dawn.
Se rompe en trocitos. Y las paredes parece que están llenas de agua. Mira la sombra. Se muere.
When Irving entered the Alhambra, or Red Castle, he was immediately struck by the balance between the exquisite gardens and the palatial interiors. To the Moors, the garden was a symbol of paradise realized on earth. This idea was extended to embrace all the elements of nature: water-irrigated gardens, cooled palace rooms, and lifted the spirit. Washington Irving had discovered a world of pure poetry. As echoed in Samuel Butler's eloquent words, the Moors believe Granada lies directly under paradise, and that they differ both no more than the upper rooms do from the floor. Visitors to the court of these Moorish monarchs were received with high esteem and prodigious ceremony in the Hall of the Ambassadors, housed within the Tower of the Comares. Built in the 13th century, the Hall of the Ambassadors was the principal audience chamber of the Moorish sultans. Delegations from Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire alike were welcomed with indulgent hospitality, for the Moors were enlightened in embracing all knowledge, irrespective of faith or denomination. Here lived tolerance and romance. As Islam forbids the depiction of the human form, Moorish artists searched for alternative paths to express their genius. They wove abstract patterns which spiral and zigzag in maze-like complexity across the walls of the palace. Their love of decoration achieved its highest form in the art of Islamic calligraphy. It was used to render texts of the Quran, such as one which admonishes, "Only God knows peace." The beauty of the Hall of the Abencerrages disguises a brutal event, for it was here that the ruling Sultan Boabdil, in a desperate bid to hold on to power, slaughtered an entire delegation. The neighboring Abencerrages clan were tricked into attending a banquet, and on entering this room, were treacherously put to death, one by one. The red stain of iron oxide mixing into the water from the central marble fountain is said to be the blood of the victims. Despite such brutal feuding, the Alhambra remains a palace of sublime beauty. Irving wrote that no part of the Alhambra gives a more complete idea of its original magnificence than the Court of the Lions.
When one looks upon the fairy tracery of the peristyles and the apparently fragile fretwork of the walls, it is difficult to believe that so much has survived the wear and tear of centuries, the shocks of earthquakes, the violence of war, and the quiet, though no less baneful pilfering of the tasteful traveler. There is a mood of delicious languor among these beautiful remains of Arab magnificence. The delightful tranquility and beauty of the place have combined to fix me here as with a spell. I wander by day and night through great halls, decorated with beautiful reliefs where there is everything assembled to delight the senses, yet where there is not a living being to be seen.
But the romance of the Alhambra is not without its tragic face. The delicate beauty of the Hall of the Two Sisters conceals a tale of unrequited love. The legend relates that these two sisters would gaze upon lovers meeting in the gardens below their latticed balcony. Distraught at not being able to taste these forbidden pleasures, the two sisters grieved for the love they would never know, and they lost the will to live. The Moors, lovers of legend, were also great engineers. They built sophisticated aqueducts to collect rainwater from the snow-clad Sierra Nevada to irrigate their glorious gardens in Granada's baking summer heat, nourishing flower beds and trees and feeding gently bubbling fountains and fish ponds. Living within this earthly paradise, the Moors were insensitive to growing Christian might, building up beyond their fortified walls. In 1492, the armies of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, surrounded Granada. Born from the belly of conflict, Moorish rule ended in surrender. witness at the collapse of the Moorish capital was Christopher Columbus. On the 2nd day of January, I saw the royal banners of your highness placed by force of arms on the towers of the Alhambra, and I saw the Moorish king kiss the royal hands of your highness. Sultan Boabdil, the last Muslim ruler of Granada, left the Alhambra through a little-used gate. He preferred to preserve this Moorish jewel than risk all for the glory of a holy war. He met the Christian king outside the city. Before going into exile, he handed over the keys. These are the last relics of the Arabian Empire in Spain. Such is the will of God. Boabdil turned for a final look at his beloved Alhambra. He could not hold back the tears. When did misfortune ever equal mine? He mourned. His mother was unforgiving. You do well to weep like a woman for what you failed to defend like a man. 400 years later, when Washington Irving left the Alhambra for the last time, he was determined to revive the dream of Moorish Spain. His parting reflections echo his love of the Moors.
The Alhambra, a Muslim palace in a Christian land, an elegant memorial of a brave, intelligent, and graceful people. I will carry away a recollection of it, clothed in all its beauty.
The Imperial Russian Summer Palace at Tsarskoye Selo was designed to impress. The Russian emperors had no need to hide quietly behind fortified walls. They shouted their opulence from the rooftops. In 1752, Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, began the creation of one of the finest palaces on earth. She thought in terms of the magnificence of Versailles and dreamt of creating a perfect palace that would evoke wonder and envy even among the richest royalty of Europe. The opulent effect desired by Elizabeth was achieved. The three-story facade of the palace, nearly 1,200 feet in length, is said to be the longest in the world, and everything about the palace was on a similar stupendous scale. An 18th century ambassador visiting the court for the first time was enthralled.
In defiance of common sense, as well as the weather and the climate, all the capitals of the pillars, the statues, and many other parts of the external structure are all gilt.
Yet if the exterior of the palace is purposefully ostentatious, it pales in comparison to the glittering interior. Every room was adorned with mirrors and gilding. One suite even surpassed the Baroque exuberance of Versailles. This was Rastrelli's masterpiece, and it became known as the Golden Enfilade, or Passage. Rastrelli's creation delighted the Empress Elizabeth. The Russian Empress named the palace the Catherine Palace, after her mother, Catherine I, who had built a small country mansion where Tsarskoye Selo now stands. At the center of this sumptuous series of rooms was a perfect treasure and a source of great comment.
One room is decorated with a very singular and uncommon style of magnificence. The walls of the apartment are composed entirely of amber. Its transparency and the consciousness of its rarity have a fine effect.
At one time, the amber stretched from floor to ceiling, but sadly, the amber room did not survive the ravages of recent wars. By using those very same skills with which this palace was built over 200 years ago, the very texture of life at the royal court is being reborn. Even the golden enfilade, which was severely damaged by war in 1944, has been faithfully transformed back to the original purity of Elizabeth's day. The Grand Hall was a favorite of Empress Elizabeth and the setting for the great state costume and dancing balls. In these imposing staterooms, more than 400 members of European royalty would gather for sumptuous galas, each vying to outshine one another. Elizabeth loved glitter and saw her palace as an ornate setting in which she was the brightest jewel.
Life in these state rooms, indeed in this magnificent palace, was meant to be lived in public, in ostentation, in luxury.
Even the stylized dance steps of the time reflected the pomp and circumstance, endless ritual and court intrigue that made up life at the palace. This was all very well for Empress Elizabeth, but it did not suit her successor, the Empress Catherine the Great, who preferred privacy and relaxation within informal surroundings. On Elizabeth's death, the Russian throne passed to her nephew, Peter III. He was a weak and ineffectual man and no match for Catherine, his sophisticated wife. Their marriage was a sham, and in July 1762, she was persuaded by one of her lovers to lead a successful coup. Catherine's entry into St. Petersburg, dressed as a colonel of the guards, was a triumph.
The soldiers came, embraced me, kissed my feet, my hands, my dress, and called me their savior. The people were mad with joy.
At her coronation as Empress of all the Russias, Catherine placed the crown upon her own head and stood with scepter in one hand, an imperial globe in the other, while cannon salutes thundered across the city. Catherine the Great loved Tsarskoye Selo. From the beginning of her reign, she moved her court here from St. Petersburg. Each spring she would arrive in time to celebrate her birthday on the 21st of April, and often stayed throughout the entire summer. Catherine wanted Russia to be an enlightened haven for Western art and culture. When she became empress, the imperial collection contained only a dozen classic paintings. Catherine sent ambassadors to scour Europe to acquire the best collections available and soon built up a gallery containing nearly 4,000 canvases. But Catherine coveted a private life. In these great courts, she lacked the privacy she yearned for. A life lived in public frustrated her private needs. As in this wistful letter to one of her flamboyant favorites, Prince Grigory Potemkin.
My little darling, good morning. As so often happens, I could not enter your apartments as the palace is full of human cattle wandering about in the passages. I greet you from afar and pray for your good health. You well know that I love you so much. I can't express my feelings.
Another of Catherine's great passions was for the gardens.
The more one builds, the more one wants to build. It's like drinking,
she confided. Catherine adored the English style of landscape design. She turned the water's edge of the great pond into a dream world of quirky pavilions and summer houses, conceived in a jubilee of styles. Above all, she wished life for her guests at Zaskoi Selo to be a summer-long idyll.
Here the court floated on gilded boats, watching regattas of gondolas.
Catherine had a great sense of fun. Wishing to capture the pleasures of the winter ice hill rides, Catherine commissioned a magnificent sledging hill or flying mountain that could be used throughout the year. In a world in which her every whim could be realized, the ride offered an ideal summer day's indulgence. This recreation captures the intricacies of its architecture and the exuberance of its design. In a flight of midsummer madness, Catherine had invented the roller coaster, a ride not without its dangers.
The ladies and gentlemen of the court sit on the sledges, and they are set going at the top and flying down to the bottom. I was terrified out of my wits, for I had not only the dread of breaking my neck, but of being exposed to indecency, too frightful to think on without horror.
Catherine the Great was indeed a monarch with a love of life. She had seen the imperial Russian dream of preeminence realized in the full sweep and extravagance of the summer palace at Zaskoi Selo, a gilded monument that heralded the dawn of an age of privilege and personal fantasy. There was one monarch who came to symbolize the desire to escape into a sublime paradise, a regal reverie of his own creation, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. King Ludwig hated the day. He traveled only at night, returning home as dawn broke. Shy and naive, he succeeded to the throne of Bavaria after his father's early death in 1864. As his reign progressed, his passion to recreate the whimsical dream palaces of his youth intensified. His ornate bedroom offered one of the most spectacular views to be seen anywhere in the Bavarian Alps. He chose this spot to build his favorite castle because of his deep love of nature. Ludwig had spent much of his youth at the neighboring castle of Hohenschwangau, where he lived with his mother. Gazing at the overhanging mountain, Ludwig wrote to his friend and confidant, Richard Wagner.
I propose to rebuild the ancient castle ruins near the Pollard Falls in the genuine style of the old German knights' castles. I must tell you how excited I am at the idea of living there. The spot is one of the loveliest that can be found. It will be far more beautiful than the lower-lying Hohenschwangau, which is defiled each year by the prosaic presence of my mother.
Inspired as much by Wagner's music as by his own fantasies, he embarked on the construction of Neuschwanstein. To Wagner's Cathedral of Sound, Ludwig responded with a hymn cast in stone. Constructed from the limestone on which it stands, the castle is virtually a man-made extension of the mountain. a symphony of spires. It is as if Ludwig is saying, where nature ends, I begin. He sought to recreate a past that never existed. Disenchanted with himself and his times, he created a dream at the top of a mountain, an inaccessible palace. But Ludwig's dream was based on legend. Neuschwanstein was a projection of his imagination, a fairy tale brought into existence. Ludwig's first inspiration for Neuschwanstein was the minstrel's hall. It existed in his mind before a single plan for the castle. Ludwig had seen Wagner's medieval opera, The Master Singers of Nuremberg, and resolved to create a hall in its honor. Ludwig became increasingly captivated by another Wagnerian hero, Parsifal, whose combination of knightly prowess and moral purity he wished to emulate. One cannot truly appreciate the minstrel's gallery unless one sees it as Ludwig did. He came here only at night. The vast chandeliers of gilded brass were aflame with candles, bestowing a texture daylight could never match. Characters from medieval legend that festooned the walls seemed to come alive in the candlelight, as if enchanted. As dawn broke, the flickering candles were snuffed out, one by one. The legendary heroes and heroines seemed to return to the shadows of the grand tableau in which they had been set by the painter's brush. In keeping with the monarch's love of the night, motifs depicting the moon and the stars infused the whole palace. Ludwig's bedroom was a Gothic shrine. The exquisitely carved pillars, surmounted with figures of medieval myth, are the product of the most scrupulous craftsmanship. Wall paintings recall the legend of Tristan and Isolde, the ill-fated lovers, seen here at their final parting. Perhaps Ludwig saw in their sad farewell a reflection of his own ill-fated love. Ludwig was 19 when he came to the throne. He was considered the most eligible bachelor in Europe. There was great excitement when, 2 years later, he announced his engagement to his 20-year-old cousin, Princess Sophie. But after much anguish and soul-searching, he ultimately broke off their engagement. Ludwig never married. He begged one of his servants,
"Preserve this room as a sanctuary. Do not let it be profaned by the inquisitive, for in it I have spent the most bitter hours of my life."
The tapestry gracing the walls of his study depicts scenes from Tannhauser, another of Wagner's masterpieces. Despite the richness of the furnishings, his study was a somber place. Here Ludwig wrote his copious diary. As he became more melancholic, he used this desk less and less. By 1871, he had almost totally withdrawn from public life, appointing princes to represent him on state occasions. Finally, he refused to talk to his council of ministers except through his hairdresser. Never far from fantasy, Ludwig had a grotto built opposite his bedroom. Here, he could commune with nature at will, without even having to leave his beloved palace. The room that was the key to Ludwig's castle was the throne room. Characteristically, it contains no throne, for Ludwig was not a monarch with a love of pomp and circumstance. If the chapel was the place for prayer, the throne room was for meditation and became a haven of spirituality. Ludwig became increasingly morbid and constantly turned his thoughts to abdication and the virtual impossibility of his own personal salvation. The end came in 1886. Ludwig's extravagance, his withdrawal from state affairs, and his baffling eccentricities prompted his uncle to have him declared insane.
Since my buildings, which are my heart's desire, have come to a standstill, the joy of my life has been taken away. All else is of trifling account.
When the commission came to arrest him, the king called out the local fire brigade to defend him. He was finally restrained by officers of state as he was climbing the octagonal staircase tower in order to throw himself from the top.
Ich komme schon.
He was taken under guard to Berg Castle by Lake Sternberg. On the evening of Whitsunday, 1886, Ludwig informed the doctor in charge of his care that he wished to go for a walk. The two men headed for the lake. Hours later, when they did not return, a frantic search began. 2 bodies were found floating in the water. The spot where Ludwig was found was later marked with a memorial cross. Were the 2 deaths pure accident, a double suicide, or a strange case of murder and suicide? History does not record the answer. King Ludwig's lasting achievement was to leave behind a unique architectural gem, a celebration of his personal quest for identity. Towards the end of the 19th century, monarchs were losing power and influence. Without their wealth, the age of the Dream Palace had come to an end. The dream had begun at Xanadu on the edge of the Gobi Desert, embracing every form of indulgence and gratification. It finally ended with Ludwig's greatest triumph at Neuschwanstein. A dream cracked, mirrored in the closing words of Coleridge's epic poem.
I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair. Wave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise.